Well, welcome to the fourth week of our study of the book of Numbers. We're going to be looking this evening at chapters 13 through 16. If you were here last week and you thought partway through, well, this is not going very well, I can't help you. This is going to be even worse this week. So we're going to start with Numbers 13 tonight. Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, as you did the Hebrews of old, you guide our steps today. Offer us opportunities, teach us truths, and save us from ourselves. Don't let us settle for safe paths or traipse down destructive dead ends. Keep us focused on your will and open to your way, that we may inherit the land that you have prepared for us and promised to us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, all right. If you have read the chapters before tonight, here is a bit of a recall for what we're going to be looking at. If you haven't read it, here's the agenda for this evening. And if this happens to be the first night that you've joined us, the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers got the Hebrew people ready to finally leave Mount Sinai and continue their journey toward the land of Canaan. That journey then begins midway through chapter 10. And so that's what we had looked at last week, where they actually begin that journey from Mount Sinai toward Canaan. But no sooner do they actually go on their way than they begin to complain about all of the hardships that they were suffering. And we looked at some of those last week. What we will do this evening is continue looking at the various complaints that they were making. So here is a quick breakdown of chapter 13. In those first 16 verses of chapter 13, there's a description of the various explorers that God calls Moses to collect to then send on their way into the land of Canaan. There are 12 men that are selected. There are not any connections whatsoever with, for instance, the 12 men that were selected to help with the censuses back in chapters 1, and I think were mentioned again in chapter 2 or 3, or somewhere about there anyway. This is a completely brand new group of men. There doesn't seem to be any rationale one way or the other as to why they selected different people, but they did. If you read the King James Version, these are spies who go into the land of Canaan. Almost all contemporary translations use another more value-neutral sort of term like explorers to go into the land. And they are charged with discovering not only the bounty of the land, but all the other things that may be in the land as well. And by that, you at least get a sense that this is not uninhabited land. There are lots of people who live there. And so in just a little ways, when we get down to the assignment, we'll find out what their actual charge is to find out about those folks. They've been complaining for 2.5 chapters. But God hasn't decided God's done with them. Despite their complaints, God continues to lead them on and push them toward getting to the land of Canaan. And now they're right on the edge of it. I mean, they're right there, ready to go in. The one thing, if you pay close attention to the names of those persons or the tribes from which they came, you would have noticed that there are no Levites connected with these explorers. There are no Levites because they are not among the soldier tribes. Their full responsibility from the moment they're 1 month old until they're dead is to take care of the tabernacle. So exploring into Canaan is not what they're responsible for. It's the other tribes that do that. Verses 17 to 20 talk about the assignment that Moses gives to them. And you might wonder as you begin reading it, well, how does Moses even know the names of these places in Canaan? We don't know the answer to that, but somehow or other he does, whether it's from God or perhaps his brother-in-law, Hobab, or maybe his father-in-law. But at any rate, he at least knows some of the primary regions just north of the border anyway. And so he tells the explorers what they are to do, and at least in a little bit how they are to go. what the journey line is supposed to take. When they leave from the desert of Paran, across the wilderness of Zin, then they're going to enter into the Negev region. The word just means parched region. If you've seen any kind of photos or remember sermons that talk about places like Beersheba, it's just parched land. It's not the kind of place where you'd want to set up shop or build a home or anything. It's a place to, for the most part, get through as quickly as you can. It's that area that is south and west of the Dead Sea. But once you get past the Negev, then you enter into what's called here, at least in my translation, the hill country. The hill country is that sort of middle part of, if we're thinking the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the middle part of the kingdom of Judah. The land that is basically an internal strip from Jerusalem down to about Hebron. And it's an area that is pretty verdant and very arable, so you can grow all kinds of grains for cattle. You can grow all kinds of cereals, whether it's wheat or barley or rye. And there's also different kinds of fruit that grow in that area, whether it's figs or pomegranates or grapes, olives. Those are all pretty popular and populous in that particular area. So they're supposed to go into that portion of Canaan and look around and see what's going on. And then there's also some questions that they are to consider to bring back a report on. But one other thing before I get to those questions. There's a note down in verse 20. This is the season for the first of the ripe grapes. They left Mount Sinai at Passover time, March, April. The time for ripe grapes is July, August. So we've now been traveling for 2, at least, maybe even as much as 3 months. You wouldn't necessarily know that based on how the narration has run, but we've traveled about 2 or more likely even 3 months at this point in time. Just keep that in mind, because time is going to get really elusive from this point on for a while. Okay, questions that they're supposed to consider, you'll find them in verse 18, verse 19, and there's some, and even verse 20, it's some really good questions. Issues about topography, as well as the military might of the area. Is the land arable or not? And if it is, how arable is it? Are the towns fortified or not? How fertile is the soil? How diverse are the crops? Well, those are all kinds of things that are good to know. And whether they were all the kinds of things that they would have necessarily had to know on the front end, regardless of how they had been acting, who knows? Based on all the complaints that they've been making, these seem like really good questions to have these explorers make some determinations about to quell or even quench a lot of the complaints that have been being made for the last 3 chapters. Incidentally, also, if you know much about Thomas Jefferson's Corps of Discovery trip that he had Meriwether Lewis and William Clark go on, these are the same kinds of questions that Jefferson had Meriwether Lewis make sure he made good diary notes on as well. Things that they were to learn as they made their way across the Louisiana Purchase territory. Well, in verses 21 through 24, the actual trip takes place, and sure enough, they do what they were supposed to. These explorers leave from the desert of Zin area and make their way north through the Negev into the hill country, and then on from there, further up north. In verse 21, that's sort of an overview verse. The desert of Zin is the far south area where they start, and Rehob toward Lebo Hamath is the very northern area. That's way up on today's Syrian-Lebanese border. It's just way up there north, far, far above the Sea of Galilee. So that tells you the expanse that they're going to cover. It's about a 250-mile stretch one way. And then once you do that, then they go back and start dealing in a little more detail in verse 22, 23, 24, telling you where they went and how they went and what they saw. What it doesn't tell you is that what they effectively did was take one of the major trade routes through the area. It's not that they were just tromping through the middle of nowhere and, they eventually kind of found their way. They were on a major trade route. It was already there that many, many, many people took all the time, and so they were making their way on up north, and then made their way back the same way south. We tend, I know at least I did, maybe I'm the only one, but I tended to think as I was growing up, there were no roads anywhere. I suppose maybe it was coming down and visiting Grandpa down here. There were no roads in Arkansas. But there were roads in Canaan. Roads have been there for a long, long time. And so, for instance, this has nothing to do with what we're reading, but one of the reasons why Moses, once they get out of Egypt, the reason they shoot off to the south was to make sure that they avoided Egyptians of any stripe. Had they gone straight toward Canaan, it would have been kind of circling the bottom part of the Mediterranean Sea and on over into Canaan. Well, that major thoroughfare had Egyptian fortifications every little bit all along that route. That's not what you would have wanted to do with 600,000, or even with 50,000, or even with 200. If you want to avoid the Egyptians, you better skedaddle the other direction. And so that's what they did. Okay, so anyway, you can see the various places that they went to, and one of the places, this is a nice map that will kind of help you see what they did. I mean, that's the entire nation of Israel eventually. And one of the things that they discovered was that in that valley of Eshcol, which is either a word that means cluster, like a cluster of grapes, or it may be somebody's name also, like Unru's Valley. This is Eshcol's valley. And one gets the sense that, my goodness, the grapes were huge there. So they're carrying them just like you would a large hog in Arkansas. Verses 25 through 29 is the report that they make once they make their way all the way back down to where the rest of the Hebrew people are. They are gone 40 days. Felice asked me last week, so, okay, what's the deal with 40 days? Is this just a nice round term? And then she stopped talking. There isn't a one-piece answer to that. If you read, well, first of all, 40 as in 40 days, or as we're getting ready to read about 40 years, 40 shows up in the Old Testament 150 times. Okay? So one can assume that 150 times it probably is more than one answer. But 40 is a term that, not the very first time it's used, but a couple of times that it's used, like in Genesis 25 and in Genesis 26, it seems pretty doggone clear that it's just kind of a round number. Isaac marries at age 40 to Rebekah. Esau is age 40 when he marries both Judith and Bashemath, or however her name is pronounced. I mean, that could be something more, but that sounds just like sort of a round number. But the first time it's ever used, and many other times in which it is used prior to this point in the book of Numbers, it seems like there may be something a little bit more to the number 40, like 40 days of rain, Genesis 7 and 8. Well, You could take it as kind of a round number of rain, but that's a weird round number to use for rain. And then there's other things like Moses being 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, receiving instruction from God. And there's even other things that involve the number of 40. Once you get a little further into the Old Testament, certainly into the New Testament, it seems just absolutely clear, at least it does to me, that that number 40 not only means possibly round number, but it definitely means the amount of time it takes God to, the amount of time that it takes to complete God's will. Now, flesh that out however you want it to mean, but the amount of time that was necessary for it to rain, to accomplish what the rain was supposed to do, the amount of time that it took Moses to receive God's instructions on the Mount, the amount of time that it took Jesus to be tempted, the amount of time, etc., etc. So those are the two pieces you've got to always fit together when you see the number 40. Is it just round number? Or is this the amount of time it takes for God's will to be completed? Well, I'd like to think that the reason we have 30 days of Lent is, at least at one level, the amount of time it's going to take for God to complete God's will for what we're hoping to have done during this period of time this year. I had nothing to do with much of anything except number 40. Kadesh is mentioned at this point. Kadesh is one of those wonderful oases in an area that is mostly parched. It's an area that was occupied early and remained occupied long. And we're going to discover as we work our way through the book of Numbers that, by golly, the Hebrew people stayed at Kadesh Barnea, a very, very long time. Once they got there, they didn't want to move again. One can hardly blame them. The explorers start off with a very positive report. Here's all the wonderful things that are there. Look at this grapes. This is great. And blah, 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 all positive. And then they get to the however. And the however is eventually going to get down to a point where they say, we don't think we should go. It's heavily fortified, and these people look like they mean business, and they are large. So it's a good report with a massive however, which then leads Caleb, one of the 12, to speak up and offer what effectively is a minority report and say, yeah, that's not what we all think. And apparently it's all but maybe him, or him and maybe Joshua, who doesn't speak up at this point. But he offers this minority report that says it's not quite that bad. And it's important that he does this because those recently complaining Hebrews, now having now heard this report with a large however, are beginning to think, we don't even want to go. It even tells us in there that they spent the entire night crying and blubbering and thinking, what on earth is God's finally going to get rid of us at this point? So Caleb speaks up and says, it's really not that bad. In fact, God, who has brought us all this way, and we've had really nothing at all to be concerned about, God's going to take care of them. Well, the other explorers make sure that Caleb's report is undercut by repeating what they said previously and then making sure that they go to each of the various tribes, probably each back to their own tribes, and holding little sessions for the rest of the night about how Caleb is absolutely wrong, and so they are furthering the dissemination of the bad reports among all of the Hebrews. And so, I mean, they're even getting to the point of just absolutely making stuff up. It's suddenly, by the time you get to the end of this report, it's not just that the people, there's lots of them and they've got fortified cities, but now these are descendants of the Nephilim. Well, if you remember from Genesis 6, these are the descendants of the angels, bad angels, and the people that lived in the land that produced these giants. Well, okay, that's fine, but you know, there is this story in Genesis that happens like in the very next chapter where there's rain and everybody dies that isn't on the ark. So where do the descendants of the Nephilim come from? Well, they don't care. They're just making up a story and saying, these are the descendants of the Nephilim. And unfortunately, the Hebrews are going to end up buying all of this. They fall prey to all the hysterical fears that the explorers report on. And so in the very first few verses there, you get the sense of what actually happens as a result of the report. And it's just more rebellion. Just more rebellion as to what we've already seen. And they give voice to all their hysterical fears that they've been harboring. They're just absolutely certain that this is not going to work out. Now, God's got them all the way to the edge of Canaan. I mean, they're right there. They're right. All they got to do is walk in. And they say, we're going to die. We're never going to get to Canaan. God has brought us here to just die out in the wilderness. Gosh, it'd be a whole lot better to die in the wilderness. Let's just go back to Egypt, in fact. So effectively what they're doing is rejecting God. Now, they've kept quiet, mostly quiet, but the closer they've gotten to Canaan, these rejections are getting stronger, and now it's become just absolutely overt. They've rejected not only Moses and Aaron, they're rejecting God. We don't want to go. We prefer to die out in the wilderness. Our spouses, our children, we're all going to be taken as plunder. Why did you bring us out here to do all of this? And if anybody does survive, well, even if we don't survive in a short period of time, God's just using us like game pieces to do whatever it is that God wants to do. And we're tired of it, and we're not going to do anything further at this point. Well, once again, this time Joshua joins Caleb in standing against that and saying, this is a bad decision, guys. Think twice before you run with what you're saying right this moment. But as one might expect, by the time you get down to verse 10, their pleas fall on deaf ears and are rejected by the Hebrew people. Moses then comes to the fore and does what he did not do a couple of chapters previously. He has regained his bearing, and he once again intercedes on behalf of the people, the same way that he did back in Exodus chapter 32, when coming down from the mount to discover the golden calf incident. And God wants to destroy the people at that point. Moses effectively buys God off, convinces God not to do that. And here again, same story, different situation, but same conclusion as well. Moses is able to intercede on behalf of the very people that have rejected him, convincing God not to end up destroying these people. God also once had tried to sort of curry favor with Moses a little bit by saying, I'm just going to destroy them and start all over with you. Again, same ideas back in Exodus 32, and Moses said, no. Here he says again, no, we're not going to do that. You're going to stick with these people. Moses' rationale is not such that it's on behalf of the Hebrew people. Moses is speaking really to God on God's behalf. What's everybody going to think, God, if you do just kill them all off? They're going to think, that's what he intended to do all along. We're not going to have anything to do with that, God. Or they're going to think, well, he couldn't even get them to enter Canaan. And so Moses is effectively saying to God, your own position in the universe is more important here. You need to back up and not destroy these people outright, like you're saying. And so God relents and says, fine, I I won't destroy all of them. But I am getting rid of those 12 explorers, minus Caleb and Joshua. They're done. They're history. And quite frankly, I'm sick and tired of all of the complaining and griping and on that the Hebrews are doing. So that entire generation, I'm going to give them what they want. I mentioned last week that we need to be careful that we don't try too hard to impose our own wishes upon God, because God may just finally get tired of us doing that and say, fine, that's what you want, it's yours. That's punishment. That's not agreement with us. And that's what happens here. Peoples, God says, they want to die in the wilderness. Fine, they can die in the wilderness. I'm not going to kill them immediately, but over the next 40 years, they'll die in the wilderness. That's fine. We don't want to go into Canaan. Fine, you're not setting foot in Canaan. So they got what they wanted. But it wasn't what they thought. If they had avoided that, they'd have been in much better shape. So, God has done everything God has said. God got them out of Egypt. He gave them law, He gave them manna, He gave them water. Brought them right up to the edge of Canaan, and the response of the Hebrew people has been, they won't. We don't care. We're sick and tired of you. Just let us go back to Egypt. And that's when God blows God's staff finally and says, fine, you can have your way. There's more in it there, but you get the general idea. It's not so much a penalty on all the rest. It's just the way all of this is going to lay out. Since they're not going to die immediately, it's going to take 40 years. It's effectively punishment against that older generation that we're just going to sit there on the outskirts of Canaan for the next 40 years. So it's 1 year for each day that you were wandering, around inside of Canaan. You're now going to spend 1 year outside of Canaan before your children are allowed in. God doesn't say that the children won't get in. In fact, they are going to get in. And some of them are, they're grown almost. These could be even 19-year-olds. They're going to get in. 20-year-olds and above are the ones who aren't going to get in. And apparently it doesn't affect any of the Levites either. Since they aren't the explorers who went in, they are not ones who are going to die in the desert along with the other 12 tribes. And then when you get down to verses 36 and 37, you discover that 10 of the 12 explorers do die immediately. They're just exterminated. And the dying of that old generation is underway. Well, all right, so the Hebrews sleep on it overnight, and then in verse 40 and following to the end of the chapter, they come back to Moses and say, you know what, having been told what you just told us, we have a change of mind now. We'd like to go ahead and enter Canaan. And Moses tells them, well, it's a little late for that. You should have made that decision earlier, and now you should not go. And they say, well, we're going to do so anyway, showing that they really don't have a change of mind, much less a change of heart about the big picture. They're still rejecting Moses. They're still rejecting God, refusing to do what Moses or God has said. They've now determined they're going in, even though Moses and God have said, no, you're not. And so Moses says, I obviously can't stop you, but I'm not going with you either. And so the armies take off and go in and try to do battle against the Amalekites, who you will remember we saw way back in the book of Exodus. And there they were able to defeat them as long as Moses was able to keep his arms upheld. And when Moses got tired, other people were holding up his arms to keep it going. But this time, the Amalekites, as well as Canaanites, just probably means lots of the other people that were living in the area, they just wreak havoc among the Hebrew people. And eventually then, those who are not slaughtered in battles make their way back to the other Hebrews, and they make no other attempt whatsoever to enter Canaan from that point forward. Not a good situation by any stretch. And then there's chapter 15. And if you're reading along, you may immediately be thinking, well, so what happened to the narration? How did we suddenly get back to this legislation stuff? A bunch of laws. Where did they come from, and how the heck do they fit into the midst of all of this? Well, there have been a lot of at least a lot of folks who claim to be Bible scholars who say, well, there's not any to it. They just kind of threw things wherever they wanted into the book of Numbers. But other folks that have come along have been able to say, well, yeah, there are some good reasons for why these laws show up where they show up. And that's certainly true for these chapters, for this particular chapter, and for these particular laws as well. The reasons may not be immediately clear, but once you kind of look at it for just a moment or two, you'll go, okay, well, I at least see it. I may not like it, but I see it. The first law that shows up, well, the first two actually, deal with offerings of various kinds. And both of them deal with offerings of various kinds that will be given to a people who are now sedentary. It's not so much people wandering around in the wilderness that these laws matter to. It's people who are now on their own little strips of land, growing crops and pasturing small animals. In other words, God has already moved on beyond that first generation. They're not dead yet, but God has already moved beyond them and is preparing that next generation for their entry into Canaan. And so, if you even look at verse 2, you'll see that it says, say to the Israelites, after you enter the land I am giving you as a home, blah, 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 blah. The legislation in this chapter is not an implicit, it is very explicit. It is a word of assurance from God, I'm still with you. I can imagine that was important to those younger folks. Now, I mean, we're not talking 5-year-olds running around, but because there's lots of the older generation still around as well, and it's had to have been assuring even to that older generation to realize, okay, we really screwed up. We're not going to get there, but God's going to take care of Junior. They're going to get in. And, you know, I mean, there comes a point in our lives, and most of us are old enough now to realize we ain't going to be around forever. But we're glad that son and daughter are on their 2 feet and doing well. It's going to be all right. If we're gone tomorrow, that's okay too. They're okay. It's a word of assurance to that next generation. I'm still with you. I think that's pretty important. We could go into a lot of details about the various offerings. I don't think we really need to, but it might be a good word to say here that while we don't pay much attention to the details, the rituals involved in these various offerings, how much bread do we add to so much cow, and do we burn it up, or we don't care much about that, but let's just at least realize that we've got our own rituals that we care a whole lot about, and don't you dare mess with my rituals or get them the least bit off. And if you're thinking, what are you talking about? I can tell you that at least in the United Methodist Church, that when there's a thing called a wedding, there are rituals that matter, and you better mind whatever mom of the bride says that she wants. I may not have to pay attention to the bride, but you better pay attention to the mom of the bride. And it, it concerns things like, where am I going to sit? And who's going to pay for the rehearsal dinner? And, on and on and on. We've got our own rituals that we toe the line on big time. So, we give some slack to the Hebrews about the things that don't really mean much to us today, because we at least understand what they were engaged in. What is important now about verse 14, it will introduce the stranger, or some translations may talk about the alien that lives in the land. That doesn't mean somebody that nobody really knows. It's that non-Hebrew that is living among them that has, for all intents and purposes, adopted Hebrew ways, hasn't yet potentially been circumcised, and hasn't fully become Hebrew, but for all intents and purposes is Hebrew. That still seems a little unclear. It'd be kind of like some United Methodists hanging out in an Episcopal church. He hadn't become Episcopal yet, but, for all intents and purposes, that you're supposed to treat him, right. Take advantage of him or whatever. The other thing is down in verses 15 and 16, it talks about ordinances and laws and regulations. Those aren't three ways to talk about the same thing. That's really three different kinds of rulings, if you will, that are being described there. And I won't go into lots of detail on it, but a regulation is kind of like a ruling on an aspect of law, whereas an ordinance is some kind of a ruling that you can't appeal. But then perhaps most important, law is really, which is Torah, is not so much law as it is like a revelation, something that you needed to know to be able to make sense of stuff in an important way. And even the kind of revelation that just knowing it offers direction to life. It helps you figure out stuff and how to get on in life. That's what Torah, that's what law is, generically speaking, in the Old Testament. And so law becomes life-giving, the Jews would say. Second law, verses 17 to 21, talk about bread, and that's really the basis for what later will become known as the showbread, the loaves that are given to the priest to be able to eat every week, in addition to whatever meats might come in from the various offerings. And it would be a wonderful way to be able to talk about tithing, the importance of tithing for the priests in a church, that people are generous and give that. I'll be implicit about that and not go any further. And then in verses 22 through 31, it begins to introduce the difference between unintentional and intentional sins, and how you make atonement, or how atonement is made for those differences. And it starts off by talking about unintentional sins of community before it talks about unintentional sins of the individual. And if you're sitting there going, well, what are we talking about if we're talking about an unintentional sin of the community? Kind of pull it into either more modern days or even into our own particular time today. I mean, we could be talking about things like slavery, or if that one just seems too openly obvious to us, well, then child labor laws might be another one. I mean, some of you may be wearing certain shoes, for instance, that are made in some other place, that are made by children that are working for pennies on the day. But gosh, you weren't aware of that, but you're supporting it by buying the shoes, or to go back to the slavery thing, You may be living in Boston and say, well, such stuff as that, but you're enjoying the sugar that you add to your coffee, which the sugar came from Jamaica, where they had all of the slaves dying so that they could produce sugar to put in your coffee, which you gladly purchased, and on and on and on and on. It's all of those things that a culture or society is built on that we all take for granted, and many of us don't really, not all of us, right, but many of us don't really think too deeply about some of it, and so we could call that kind of unintentional. Now there's a point there where unintentional kind of seeps over and becomes intentional after a while, but I think you get the point. So there's unintentional communal sins, and if those happen and you become aware of them, well then here's how you address it. And most of God's people, whether it's going to be Hebrews in the Old Testament or Christians, whoever today, you find out about something like that and you immediately want to take care of it. You stop buying this, or you start doing that, or you look into this other, and so you introduce changes into life as a result. Now, I'd have to very quickly add here, I still buy the coffee that I want to buy, period. But, it doesn't mean that we don't have things to work on. We do. We do. And it also is one of those situations where in our own faith as Christians, we recognize that even if we can, as individuals say, well, I don't sin, there's all these unintentional things, like gasoline motors produce pollution, like kills people. Well, I'm no murderer, but I drove my truck over here tonight, so I added to it. Yeah, but how are you going to get over here? Otherwise, you can't walk. Okay, I'll drive my vehicle, but it's a gasoline engine and it produces pollution. So that's where we talk about the cross of Christ, making atonement for us, even if it is in those situations that I'm kind of stuck and don't have a whole lot of time. These are the things that life is like in the world today. Or, just all the other things where I live as a king, Patty lives as a queen, and you and yours do the same where you are, because you've got washing machines and dryers and freezers and refrigerators, and that no king or queen would have ever even dreamed of even 100 years ago. But you take perfectly for granted and go ballistic if you don't have it. So there's where the atonement of Jesus comes in and covers us and doesn't say it's okay, but it gives us the space to be able to get on with life and, figure out our ways that we can kind of make up for some of this other stuff that we're engaged in. Enough said about that. Last little bit of the chapter talks about the tassels on the garments. And you think, well, how does that fit in with any of this other legislation? Well, okay, so how are you going to remember all this stuff we've been talking about? Well, we need mnemonic devices, we need pictorial things, we need touchy-feely stuff, and so God gives them a little touchy-feely thing. The word tassel, tzitzit in Hebrew, the numerical value of that's 600. And if you add up the number of knots that you put in these tzitzit that I'm going to give you, well, it's going to equal up to 13. And so 613 is the number of all the laws that the Hebrews ultimately have. So you'll be able just to have these things on your garments, and every time you touch them or look down at your clothes, you'll remember that God's law is really important. If If there's one of them that you've been thinking about lately, you can recall it. So it's a helpful device. It's kind of like in its own way a phylactery on the forehead or the forearm that reminds you of God's law that's inside of it, the little verse that you have memorized. Jews, even to this day, continue to have those on their clothing in all kinds of what look to us sort of weird ways. You know, they don't have to be that long. Gets kind of gaudy after a while. But Jesus, for instance, in the New Testament, if you read it carefully, it depends on the translation you're looking at, but it will talk either about the fringe or the hem of a garment. The word could just as easily be translated, as opposed to fringe or hem, the tassel on the garment. So when the woman comes up to Jesus and wants to touch the tassel on the garment, that's what she's. If I can just even touch that tassel on his clothing, it will make me well. And then everything hits the fan. We don't know how much time has passed. It could be a few days, it could be a few months, it could be a few years. All we know is that, for sure, put our finger on, is that when the explorers get back from their explorations in Canaan, that they meet Moses and the rest of the Hebrews back at Kadesh. But if you go back in the story, before they go to Canaan, they're not at Kadesh. Which lets us know that while the explorers are up in Canaan, the Hebrews down south are kind of wandering around, just going from spot to spot, or at least a spot or two, while the others are exploring and they have to find them somewhere. Or maybe they told them that we're eventually going to get to Kadesh. Who knows? We're eventually going to get to Kadesh. If you jump ahead in the story to Exodus, or to Numbers 33, you're going to see a listing of all the various encampments that the Hebrews were at. From the point in time when they first leave Egypt until they do finally get into Canaan. A whole bunch of those are before Mount Sinai, and a whole bunch of them are right at the very tail end when they finally get the go-ahead. Okay, enough time has passed, and it's time for you to get on into Canaan. So there's a whole bunch of encampment spots on that last little bit of time. There are not any encampments from the point in time when they come back from exploring Canaan until that last little bit of movement just before they head to Canaan, which suggests that they may have spent 38, 39 years hanging out in Kadesh. It was an oasis. It was the best spot in between Egypt and Canaan, hands down. So I'm not saying they never moved from one spot in Kadesh to another, but it's very possible if we can look carefully at those verses in Exodus 33, and don't jump ahead and go looking at it. Yeah, we don't have anything to say that week when we get to it. But it could very well be that the wilderness wanderings is kind of a misnomer. They really don't do much wandering in the wilderness. The wandering is kind of before and at the tail end. In fact, we're going to discover, and I will go ahead and broach this subject here, of the 40 years that they are out there, supposedly wandering in the wilderness, a year of it is mostly at Sinai, and the last 6 months or so takes place from the death of Aaron until the death of Moses, when they're making that last little transition up to get into Canaan. So that leaves about 38 and a half years to cover most of what we're doing in the book of Numbers. And, you know, it was 2 or 3 months or so that got us up to chapter 13, 14. And there's not much goes on between the death of Miriam and Miriam and Aaron. So there's about 38 years that's going to be covered by chapter 16. And you go, well, why is not more said? And here would be my explanation for that. If you're reading through 2nd Chronicles, 1st or 2nd Kings, 1st Chronicles, you'll read about King so-and-so was a bad king. King so-and-so was a good king. And if you start paying attention to it, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of verses about good king so-and-so. But when you read about bad king so-and-so, it just says, and Tom became king and lived for such and he was a bad king and he lived and died. That's a theologically incredibly astute way to talk about bad King Tom. If he was bad King Tom, why would you want to know him? Worthless fool. You know? So you got to mention him. That's all you got to do, and you're done with it. There's nothing helpful about bad King Tom. 38 years, it just goes on in the wilderness. There's nothing to say about it. It just had to come and go. Period. Nothing more needs to be reported. And you think, well, why? Inquiring minds want to know. And so you've got chapter 16. You want to know what was going on in 38 years? I'll tell you a story about what was going on during those 38 years. One was like this. Those complaining gripers, well, okay. It wasn't just the 12 tribes, it was also the Levites. In fact, one of the Kohathites, the best of the Levites, the ones who actually get to carry the actual items of importance from inside the tent, the tabernacle itself, even them, they wanted to have more than what they had. So they started complaining. So this guy named Korah, he raises a stink and he gets 250 people together and he does just like Miriam and Aaron had done earlier. He tries to take on Moses and say, well, who made you special? We're all holy. Well, yeah, we are. What makes you any more special than any? Well, nothing makes him any more special. He's absolutely right about the two claims he makes, but we're all equal. Yeah, we are all equal in God's sight. But just because we're equal in creation doesn't mean we're equal in terms of the roles that we have. God raises some people up to be eyeballs and some to be ears. It doesn't mean we're exactly the same, that we're interchangeable. It's that we work together to do what God wants us to do. And so you can't just claim that you can do anything you please. But he wants to. He wants to do it on that basis of putting forth two ideas that in themselves are perfectly true, but lead to a wrong conclusion. And then he joins forces with a couple other guys, Dathan and Abiram, who are Reubenites. And if you're thinking, well, how did they get together? Well, then you remember that these guys are kind of hanging out right side by side over there on the southern side of the tabernacle. So if anybody, it could be any, but it's not like the Kohathites were getting together with the Naphtalites. They're getting together with the guys right next. When they get together to bed at night, they're right there with their campfires next to each other. They can grouse over the campfire. So it's pretty sensible that it's the Reubenites and the Kohathites who are getting together here. And they're going to take on Aaron. That's who they want to see what they can do in terms of getting Aaron's job for themselves. And so there's 250 of them that are going to make fire. They think they can do what the priests are all engaged in doing. And so Moses, he's just almost had it at this point with the Hebrews themselves. He says very clearly that you guys are being insolent, you're being envious, you're not accepting the roles that God has given you to play, and that they're already exalted roles. What's your problem here? But listen to what the kinds of things that they do. There's a lot of fun stuff in here where Korah will say something, and then Moses will repeat it back in another way. Or Moses will say something, and Dathan and Abiram will repeat the words but mean something completely different. And so read back through this and see how that happens from time to time. But Abiram and Dathan even go so far as to say that as far as they are concerned, the land that flows with milk and honey is Egypt. It is not Canaan. So it's not like there's any repentance in any of these folk that have happened over however much time we're talking about during this 38 years. They are still as wrapped up with themselves and rejecting of God and God's ways as they have ever been. They still don't want anything to do with God. They still don't want anything to do with Canaan. As far as they're concerned, they just as soon go back to the old enslaving ways, rejecting God. A lot more can be said of that, but I'll just leave it at that. So, Moses says, fine, you want to be priests. Let's give you a job to see if, in fact, God has called you to be priests. I'm not going to judge on it, but let's just jump right to it then. And so he says, let's meet tomorrow. Bring your censers, which doesn't mean censors. It means censors. And so bring your censers with you, and we'll let you make fire. So we do. Now, if you've been a careful reader, you may remember when the last time somebody made fire. It wasn't a priest. Or actually, they were priests, but they just made it wrongly. Now, I know you're all careful readers, but you just don't remember that far back. So if you go back to the book of Leviticus, to chapter 10, you'll remember that Aaron actually has 4 sons. The first two, the 2 oldest, Nadab and Abihu, got real excited when they became priests and went out the next day and decided, cool, we can now make fire. And they didn't make it correctly and got zapped right on the spot. So Moses has remembered that and said, you want to be priests? You think you are priests? Let's do the thing that only a real priest can do. Let's make fire. And so they agreed to it. Apparently they forgot about Nadab and Abihu. Or maybe they thought they were truly priests. Anyway, next day shows up, and sure enough, I'm getting the order a little out of joint here, but they'll attempt to make fire, and when they attempt to make fire, it all goes wrong, and all 250 of them, just like Nadab and Abihu, die on the spot. They were not priests after all. And Korah and Dathan and Abiram, because of their insolence, along with their families, not all of Korah's family, but most of their families will then be swallowed up by the earth. They'll be shipped down to Sheol, fully conscious. And their stories will come to an end. And however we want to look at it, or add to it, that's the kind of thing that's going on across 38 years. What need is there to tell you any more about that 38 years? Bottom line, over those 38 years, they all die off. And then there's a chance to, again, move forward. Well, there's a tale there for all of us at all times, in all places of life, whether we're talking about our own personal lives or we're talking about church life. You can apply this stuff so easily to what's going on. There are these moments in time that you have to do what is right, need to do what is right, and not try to impose your will on God, but to listen to what God is saying and then act appropriately and responsibly as you move forward. But that's not even to the end of chapter 16. There's one more thing that happens. You would think, watching Korah and Dathan and Abiram kick the bucket along with 250 so-called priests, that the rest of the folks that were standing around watching would have gone, ooh, okay. No, I mean, rebellion is so deep that if you look then at verses 36 through 50, you see how everybody else responded. And so you begin to understand why there, again, is no need to talk about these 38 years, because everybody else shows their own problems. They're just upset that 250 of their best leaders just died. How dare you lump all these people off our committees and get rid of them? We want them on our committees, dadgummit. And so we're not going to follow. We're not following anyone, but we're tired of the way you're doing what you're doing, Moses and Aaron and everybody else. Well, I haven't had an opportunity to say much about this. If you go back through these chapters, look for the mentions of the glory of the Lord. In each one of these moments, there's a crescendo building. And while the crescendo is building, then there's a sort of little side note that says, the glory of the Lord appeared. And it's like, I mean, you could do a great Star Wars or some kind of movie based on the glory of the Lord showing up, getting ready to go boom to everybody. If we had that sort of theology of God. But anyway, the glory of the Lord sort of shows up to take care of God's own, to make sure that things don't get completely out of hand. Each time these folks in rebellion are just about to unleash something, then the glory of the Lord appears. It does the same thing here as well. People show up and say, what are you doing? And then the glory of the Lord appears in verse 42. Well, Moses does what he's done on some other occasions. He falls down in prayer and intercession, and almost immediately apparently realizes, yeah, that's the wrong thing. That ain't going to work this time. God's just sort of had it. And so he immediately tells Brother Aaron, laying next to him, you need to get up, go get a censer. Again, not one of these, but one of these. And you need to run out there in the middle of where God has put the plague on all these folk and put an end to it. And you think, well, what's that all about? Well, if we were to go back earlier in the story, one of the things that the priests do is they cense around the curtain inside the tabernacle to make sort of a smoke screen, so that it's impossible to see what's going on there, so that nobody sees and dies or gets killed by what's going on back there. And so the smoke screen helps. You think, that's silly. Well, okay, but I mean, you understand it at least. So Moses can't do it. It's got to be a priest who does that. Send a priest. Aaron is. So Moses says, Aaron, you got to get up and get your censer out there. So Aaron gets up and he gets some hot coals or whatever, of incense, and he runs out there in between a place where people are dying and not dying, and throws a bunch of the coals of the incense, which begins to make a little smoke screen. Now, granted, it's not a big enough smoke screen for 600,000 people, but you know, I mean, it's the intent. And sure enough, it functions that way. The plague comes to an end. Now, still 14,700 people died as a result of it, but hey, who's counting? We got to get rid of a whole bunch of folks over these 38 years anyway. It's just, you know, it's another 2.5%, and we're now closer to being able to get on our way. If you like fine art, this is one of those wonderful paintings that at first you look at it and just say, yeah, that's too busy. There's too much stuff going on there. But in the wonderful way they used to do, Moses is in this picture 3 times. And it's telling you the story of chapter 16. Here are the people trying to stone Moses at the beginning of the chapter, and Joshua stopping them. Here's Moses as the people, Korah and Dathan and Abiram, are falling into the earth. There's a little slit here. I know you can see that well where you are. And then here, Moses is close to, it looks like Pope Aaron, but it's priest Aaron, who is flinging his censer, the censers that the Roman Catholics in that period do, as opposed to this kind of censer, and people are responding to that. What doesn't make sense so much on the front end to us might be Constantine's arch in the background.
That's because you're right.
But that's Botticelli's attempt, or maybe it's the Pope's attempt, because this is, of course, in the Sistine Chapel, where they're selecting new popes, saying, back off and don't go trying to do anything to the Pope. Because this is a quotation from Hebrews saying, Aaron is God's right-hand man, doing well. So, you know, Botticelli did a good job tossing a whole bunch of stuff in there. If you take the time to spend really looking at it, you'll see the whole story. All right, we've used our time up tonight. I haven't talked about ways to sort of think about or apply that today. That would be sort of fun to do, but maybe we can start with that next week. Appreciate you coming. Next week, we'll look at chapters 17, 18, 19, and the very first part of 20. Now, I've already sort of let the cat out of the bag. Between chapter 16 and that early part of 20, 38 years have passed. Okay? And there's just really nothing to say about it. We're going to say what needs to be said, a little bit that's there. So come next week, and thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Nice.